decided to make the glass shield from Oblivion because I like the frankly appalling shade of green that it is. And long story short, I had a lot of issues printing this. I wanted it to be see-through. You can kind of see like the lights coming through it, so that was like my main goal of this. And the only color filament I could find that I liked was actually PETG, which I've printed with successfully before, but never on a model this thin. This is mostly like 1.2 millimeters thick, so 2 walls with 0.6 millimeter nozzle. And there was a whole crap ton of issues that I've never had with PETG, so there was actually peeling on the edge of some of the pieces, and I printed this in like 10 pieces, so there's gaps here, like down here, even between some of the other pieces around the edge. There was an unholy amount of just like plastic fuzz, not strings, like fuzz and like crud embedded in the print. So that was sanded aggressively off by the time you're seeing this part right now. And just like a whole host of other weird stuff. So this is basically just going to be me showing you how I attempted to fix this, especially because I had to like patch some areas on stuff that's supposed to be clear, etc. And I basically have decided to finish this no matter how angry I am at it, so without further ado, let us begin. Alright, so first thing I did is tried to get off as many of the gross, like really obvious blobs and zits as I could, and then I was just like, screw it, I'm gonna glue this whole thing together and see what happens. So I used super glue and an accelerator, and normally I don't use accelerator, but in this case the pieces were so thin and fit together so badly that I kind of had to use it or else nothing would stick. So what I did is a little bit the same process as I did for the multi-expression mask, if you saw that video, where I put a few drops of glue in sort of key areas, sprayed them down so they'd hold, and then I went back once that was set, and I added some more glue to the rest of it. And again, this is, in this case, was just sort of, it was easier to work in small pieces, but it also, if I glued something in the wrong spot, it's easier to go back and take it off. And in that case, this was a real concern because half of the time I was holding the pieces together with my toes, which is far from accurate in my case. So that's pretty much what I did for the glue. When it was done, when I got around to like the very last piece, I was like, wow, there's just a colossal gap here. And I actually had pretty aggressively pull and like push my pieces of my model together, and I was only able to get about 1 inch of glue, so there's a really, really big piece of, or like huge gap in the bottom of this shield. Mercifully, that was on an area that's going to get painted in sort of leather finish, so it was easier to patch that than some of the other things. What I decided to do to fix some of this horribleness is just to use the Durham's Rock Hard Water Putty to fill some of the gaps that are over opaque areas, or like areas that are, like I mentioned, going to get painted over in sort of leather that don't need to be transparent, because what it looks like underneath doesn't matter for those areas. There were some areas where there were gaps in the sort of green glass clear part, and that I was like, I'm gonna try to get some epoxy and maybe just fill that in with epoxy that I tinted with acrylic paint. I've used acrylic paint successfully in the past to tint things, and if you don't add an absurd amount of paint, it still comes out transparent. So I went to Michael's and picked up the closest horrible neon green paint color that I could find, and it actually turned out to work pretty well. Then I pretty much just sort of started working. So the first thing I did was I filled some of the larger gaps with the Durham's Rock Putty, and I wasn't being too careful with smoothing this because it's actually on a textured area, and it doesn't really matter if it's lumpy to me. And then I did a coat of epoxy. To make sure it didn't ooze through the shield, I tried to put some clear packing tape on the back. The first layer still ended up oozing through, but it did sort of fill in the gap between the packing tape and the shield, so that next time I went in, I filled it and it didn't seep through. It just sort of had like one area to fill, and it actually filled it. So that was nice. It did take a few coats of epoxy to sort of get all the holes filled. And I just sort of repeated that process until I had something that was like reasonably unholy. So again, after the first coat of epoxy, I filled in some other areas with Durham's, and then did another coat of epoxy. I did sort of alternate Durham's and epoxy on the bottom, because I wanted the epoxy for the strength on that huge hole, and then the Durham's just to sort of like fill in the cracks behind it. And after all of that was done and all of the cracks were filled, it still looked pretty dang awful. There were big strings of plastic everywhere, which were now coated in epoxy. There were, frankly, a lot of really, really sharp bits on it, which I assume were just sort of like pieces of plastic that were now cemented, sticking up in a little pointy position. Foam brush from the epoxy spreader that I was using, also just everywhere. And some of the seams where I'd glued the pieces together were a little bit wonky. So I went in and I sanded the entire thing aggressively with the most abrasive bit I could find for my Dremel. And I literally went over everything I could reach with it. So like all of the glass areas, all of the other areas, just everything got Dremeled really, really aggressively, front and back. I did notice as I was doing this, so I hadn't put any epoxy on the back, and it did seem like the areas where there was epoxy, frankly, honestly, I removed most of it when I hit it with the Dremel, but it seemed like the areas where there was epoxy Dremeled much nicer. Like all those little bits of plastic came off way easier, way smoother, left a better finish behind. On the back where I hadn't epoxied, it was kind of super messy, and it was actually way harder to get an even finish, which was kind of weird. So I don't know, to me it feels like, oh, I wasted so much epoxy, I put it on and then I just Dremeled it off again. But I've actually done that on like 2 projects now, and it does for some reason make everything go way smoother, and I don't know why. But either way, once that was done, I did have something at that point that looked relatively smooth, except for the little areas that I couldn't reach with the Dremel. So I just went over and did another coat of epoxy on the entire thing, which kind of designed to go in and like fill in all the marks that were left from the sanding. And I have noticed, so haven't tried this on PLA, but PETG sands much, much nicer. And I did notice that both the areas of sanded epoxy and sanded PETG, pretty much when you coat them in epoxy, those gross sanding marks go away almost immediately if you do the front and the back. So that was really, really nice. Otherwise, I probably would have ruined the shield doing that. But yeah, so that's pretty much where I am right now, just having done the sanding and the extra coat of epoxy, and I've been tinting all of the coats green just for grins in case there's extra little surface detail that it needs to fill in. And there's still some unevenness in the surface. I decided that apart from the sort of removing the massive chunks of black foam that are stuck everywhere, I would just sort of go in and paint the thing and then add some more epoxy, because right now there's a little bit of unevenness. Some places I put the epoxy on a bit too thin, but I'll just sort of fix that later because I am angry at this and I want it done, and I've been spending too much time on it. So that is how I have fixed this up until this point. I'm still not happy with the shield, but the patching seems to have worked out pretty well. It's a little bit hard to see because this color is awful to record, but there's a pretty big seam here, which I patched with that tinted epoxy. It seems to have done pretty well. Same thing on this side, there's another one. And, I mean, you can see it, it's pretty obvious if you hold it up to the light. You can also see the seam right here. And they do have a little bit of a clear tint to it from the clear epoxy, but it's honestly not that bad considering how terrible the first print was. One of my biggest peeves about this, honestly, is like this huge thing right here where you can just like really clearly see there's a big seam in it. And then this is that giant gap at the bottom, which was filled with, again, epoxy for strength, then Durham's, then sort of more epoxy, and then I sanded it down to try to get an even texture and all of that good stuff. For those of you curious, this is the back of the shield, and this is like pretty much had much less stuff done to it. So, I don't know, I mean, this is really hard to film, but you can sort of maybe see with the shiny white highlights where all of the little bumps are. If I run my fingers over this, you can hear how, like, not smooth it is. Oh my god. There's like a colossal blob just right here. So this I'm gonna have to come back with the Dremel and, like, hit this whole back part again. But once I do that, it should hopefully be pretty smooth. But yeah, like I said, I'm probably just gonna hit this with some paint and then come back and sort of fix all that, because I just need to be done with this insane project. But, again, it is kind of cool how the light shines through it. Alright, so over the next few days, I will also be publishing tutorials about using some of the products I mentioned in this video, like the XTC 3D epoxy, Durham's Rock Putty, not sponsored, I just like using them. I'll be doing videos about how I finally paint and finish this monstrosity, as well as a few other props, and assorted other things. I'm doing a bunch of videos for my students, which is why I'm suddenly like, CONTENT! And I'll also, at some point when I have free time, my life's been like crazy hectic, update you guys on the 10 armor, 10 weeks thing that I started doing a while ago. I didn't hit the goal of an armor a week, but I did do some kind of fun props as well as a bunch of commissions, so it wasn't a complete waste of time and I haven't forgotten about it. I just haven't gotten a chance to actually make proper update videos, so I will do that at a time. Which is not right now. Goodbye. Or something.